Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Deirdre McCloskey. Hello, Deirdre. How are you
Hi,
doing?
I'm okay. I'm here in Chicago.
And I'm here in Jamaica. And Deirdre, so for the longest time, we've been talking about you on this show. I interviewed Claudia Williamson and we discussed your books. I
Yeah,
interviewed Donald Boudreaux. How do you pronounce his last name again?
Boudreaux,
Yeah, Boudreaux. So I interviewed him at
Boudreaux,
Boudreaux.
Dro.
Oh, Joe. Okay, then.
Yeah.
So I interviewed him and we talked about your books. And during personal conversations, I often mention Deirdre McCloskey. So today I get the brilliant opportunity to pinch your mind. So Deirdre, I've read several of your articles. Recently, you wrote a critique of James Robinson's new book, The Narrow
That's right.
Corridor, and I
That's right.
interviewed James on my show some time ago.
Yeah.
And that article was interesting, but I'm going to start with my questions, beginning with,
Okay.
with your trilogy, the second book in your trilogy, and we're going to do it on a phase by phase level.
Certainly.
Starting with savings. Deirdre, are savings important? Do savings explain the great divergence?
No. And there are all kinds of historical and economic points to be made here, but I'll make only a couple. The first one is that savings is what humans do and always have. I mean, in archaeological sites, they find hundreds of so-called Acheulean hand axes. They weren't actually axes, but that doesn't matter. They find hundreds of them. And these were made from flint, by crashing the flint and making a sharp point. So anyway, there are hundreds. So that's saving. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, the yield of, say, wheat per seed that you stick in the ground, which is, after all, what you can eat too, stick it in the ground, was extremely low, 4-to-1. You put one seed in the ground, you get 4 new seeds, as it were, which you can eat. But that means 1/4 of the grain crop went back into the earth every year. See what I mean? And the Romans built Roman roads, which were very expensive and involved a lot of savings. And the Chinese, admittedly by forced labor, built the Grand Canal, which was the longest canal in the world for centuries, and the Great Wall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So historically, the problem is that savings has always been a very large part of every economy that you can name. From the economic point of view, the problem is that the thing you're doing with savings, capital formation, right? Buildings, machines, seed in the ground for that matter, great walls, has sharply diminishing returns, in the sense that if you look, suppose the Chinese built a second Great Wall just behind the other one. Well, that would be a stupid thing to do, obviously. Or suppose you built a second and third house for yourself, or bought 5 new automobiles. It's obvious that there's sharply diminishing returns to sheer capital accumulation. So no, savings, this goes back to Walt Whitman Rostow, who claimed the opposite. Savings didn't cause the great enrichment.
Exactly. And Deirdre, I remember in your book, you arguing that medieval peasants, they saved.
Sure, they had to, or else they starved. If they didn't put that 1/4 of the grain crop, while their children back in their hut are crying in hunger, if they didn't put it into the ground, throwing it, broadcasting it's called, then the next year there would be no crop.
Savings, therefore, are only feasible when one is interested in innovating. So
well, it's not so much feasible. That's not quite the word I'd use, although I understand what you're saying. It's only profitable. It's only worth doing if you have a new idea. Although that's not quite true, I would have to say. The circular flow, the income we now have, we can achieve tomorrow by doing exactly the same thing we did today, right? We go on with the same routine. You interview me again tomorrow and again the next day, and the next on like a Groundhog Day experience. And then income stays the same. But to raise our game, to make income much higher as it has been over the last couple of centuries, we need new ideas, because then it'll be profitable to do a new investment. You invent powered flight, and then it's worth investing in airplanes. Otherwise, obviously, it's not.
I'm happy that we're talking about ideas. So Deirdre, you're a scholar, and obviously you have read way more books and have written more books than I have. I'm yet to write a book. But there's a debate going on in sociology and economics today, Deirdre. Some argue that an affluent mindset is correlated with economic growth, whereas others contend that an affluent mindset can be divorced from our life conditions. Do you have any insight on this issue?
Well, there's an old argument that Max Weber, the great economic sociologist, you'd call him, in Germany, made a century ago, which is precisely that, say, Calvinism caused Europeans to act, how can I say, more vigorously, especially on the savings front. So his argument has the same problem that I just mentioned, historically and economically. Great wealth can be, of course, corrupting, but so can poverty. So I don't think the crucial issue in the great enrichment is the distribution of income.
Exactly. And another fascinating point, the concept of mindset, is that I recently completed the book where I like Joseph's works. I think that they're interesting, and in it he enunciates the point that a state can be wealthy, yet people are likely to succumb to a zero-sum game and not a positive-sum game. In other words, an affluent mindset does not necessarily, an affluent environment does not necessarily drive a positive-sum mentality.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, in fact, it's happening right now worldwide. That, I think, is the idea of fuel behind populism. That, those people, whoever they are, Jews or foreigners or the Chinese or the rich of our own country, are taking all our money, and that's why we're poor. So there's an element of the sin of envy in populism, which is very dangerous, because envy can't ever be satisfied. There are women who are more beautiful than me. There are men and women who are smarter than I am, and so forth. And if I just spend all my time being envious of everyone I could be envious of, you're in Jamaica, a country I'd like to visit and haven't ever, so I'm envious of you that you're in Jamaica. There, you can just go on and on and on. You can't ever stop. So envy and this worry about the very rich, or not worrying about the very poor, and that's what we should be worrying about, but the very rich is a mistake.
You're correct, Deirdre. Envy is actually negatively correlated with economic development and other positive correlates of human progress. Boris Gershman, he has many interesting studies on the topic of envy.
Oh, is that so?
Yes.
Could you, I vaguely remember the name. Maybe I read a book. I don't think so. Could you please send me the citation?
Yes, I will.
By email when you get a chance.
I will. Boris writes on slavery, envy. He has a special interest in the developing world. So more than likely you have seen his name. He's a highly cited economist.
I think I may even own the book. If it's simply called Envy.
I think that's the book by Elmott. who died.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
that's another one. Well,
yeah.
could you please send me
Yes,
these
I
citations?
will. I will.
Because I've been kind of thinking about envy recently, and that'll be helpful.
Yeah, I have an article on envy too. I can send
Oh,
you
do you?
the article. Yes,
Please do.
I will. But Deidre, you like Jamaica like so many people. Jamaica has recorded negative growth rates. And
Oh, yeah.
my own view is that the predominant traits in Jamaica are negatively aligned to development. So, for example, individualism versus collectivism. Jamaica is on the collectivistic side of the spectrum. The culture is more
Yeah.
embedded than autonomous. Envy is a prominent ideology in Jamaican pop culture. And as we said earlier, envy is negatively correlated with development. There's
Yeah.
also the issue of intellectual openness. Jamaican culture is more conformist than open to ideas. So
Yeah.
whenever I'm speaking to foreigners, I often say the country is ripe for development, but its institutions are weak, and too many of the dominant traits in Jamaica are correlated with negativity. So for example, defeatism versus an affluent mindset. People with an affluent mindset are more innovative. In Jamaica, the scarcity mindset is more dominant. Some people will say that they're poor and they're proud to be poor. Poverty is not a badge of honor. And I'm
Yeah.
saying this because it reflects your work. Bourgeois
Yeah.
dignity. We became wealthy
Yeah.
when dignity was privileged or respected.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's right. But of course, the so-called bourgeois revaluation, which I detect from all kinds of indications in the 18th century in Britain, for instance, in both England and Scotland, is a let's see, what was I going to say? Is let's see, oh yeah, it's not that you just respect people who are rich. You start to respect people who might become rich by working hard, by innovating, by thinking new ideas. So it's essentially it's a liberal mentality that begins to take hold. Now, as anyone who knows Britain as well as I do, knows that it's still true that in Britain hierarchy matters. That someone with a sir or a lady in front of his or her name gets more respect than plain Mr. or Ms. But it's tremendously changed since, say, the 17th century in the same country, in England, in which all that mattered was rank. All that matters was born rank, in fact. So accomplishments off of the battlefield didn't matter. So, and then there's this change, this honoring, which you see, for example, in Jane Austen, of all people, Jane Austen, the novelist, in the very early 19th century, an upvaluation of work, and not just hard work, because everyone works hard. Poor people work hard, everyone works hard, but of market work, of buying low, selling high, manufacturing, and so forth.
Exactly. England is such a fascinating case. I like the story of England. It's quite compelling. I never get bored by reading after article explaining why the Industrial Revolution occurred in England. But in the future, I want to see a book chronicling the age of reform in Scandinavia.
That's very interesting. That's an interesting observation, because there are sort of 2 points to be made. In agriculture, Scandinavia, most specifically both Sweden and Denmark, had an enclosure movement, so-called, contemporaneous with the one that happened in England. But that didn't make them, even though agriculture, of course, was a very big part of these economies in the 18th century. But both Denmark and Sweden, along with Sweden and Norway, switched to liberal economic policies in the middle of the 19th century. That's well after in Britain, but it had astonishing effects. Swedish economic growth in the late 19th century is very fast. And of course, the Swedes were very well educated. So education doesn't do it by itself, and very inventive even in a small way. But in the late 19th century, this innovation was freed. The Swedes, for example, this is not widely known, invented the ball bearing. Well, without ball bearings, you couldn't have machines that, like an airplane engine, that turned around very fast. It just, the metal would burn up.
I'm really happy that we're talking about Sweden. So usually, Deirdre, when I interview a distinguished scholar like yourself, I have tailor-made questions. But when you're speaking to a genius like Deirdre McCloskey, the light bulb, yes, the light bulb keeps going off. And I'm saying, Deirdre, maybe it's time for us to truly test the shock doctrine by looking at economic growth in Scandinavia before the modern era. And by modern era, I'm referring to the 21st century. So, for example, the age of reform in Scandinavia, maybe this is a case study to support the shock doctrine. Should we reform, or should it be radical, or should it be of a gradual nature? And I'm talking about economic reforms. Maybe Scandinavia is a good case study.
I don't care if it goes slow or fast, just so that it goes. I mean, for example, in Sweden, they built a canal linking up the Great Lakes in the middle of the country with Stockholm in the northeast and Gothenburg in the southwest. And this was done over 20 years with a Scottish engineer in charge, with conscript soldiers, so essentially temporary slaves. And of course, making a canal for strategic reasons and for economic reasons, they thought, in the early 19th century was a silly project, because it was immediately overtaken by the railway, which is a much more efficient way of moving soldiers back and forth across the country and moving goods back and forth. So this state enterprise, this very big state enterprise in Sweden, was a waste of money. Same thing happened, by the way, in the United States, where states like Ohio and Indiana would subsidize the building of canals, which immediately proved unprofitable. Very few of the canals built in the 1830s and 40s in the United States made any money at all, and most of them were disasters. So it's the late 19th century in which, in both Sweden and the United States, non-state enterprise really gets going.
Of course, you're correct, Deirdre, but it is not widely known that during the period of industrial development in America, businessmen who were less likely to rely on government subsidies were often more productive and profitable, especially in the railway sector.
Yeah, although they're on the same grounds as so-called internal improvements was the vocabulary in the United States, on the same grounds as subsidizing canals, or there were indeed subsidies to the transcontinentals, Northern Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the Southern Pacific, which went across the country to Oregon and California. But you're right. Most of what happened in the growth of income in the United States, I would say right through to the present, is private. And actually the same thing's true in Sweden. People often think of Sweden, especially in the United States, people think of Sweden as socialist. Well, not really. Most property is private. The government owns very little property, actually. People are admired for their achievements, not for their aristocratic status or their race. It's a capitalist country. Most prices virtually all prices in Sweden are determined by supply and demand, not by some central planner.
Yes, people need to read Johan Norberg. Sweden became rich before the welfare revolution. And
That's right.
interestingly, Deirdre, according to the World Value Survey, people in Scandinavia, they actually value autonomy.
Yeah, sure they do. I've taught in Sweden for not for any enormous length of time, but if you add it all up, something like half a year in a bunch of episodes. And I've taught in Holland for 3 years. And contrary to what a lot of Swedes and Dutch think about themselves, they're actually very individualistic. They are rather, as you described the Jamaicans as being rather uniform in their opinions. There's not quite as much diversity of opinion as there is, say, in Britain.
Yes, and this can predict innovation and in some cases, even economic growth.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think economic growth and innovation are the same thing. And understand that innovation doesn't have to be glorious and
exactly
big.
my point.
It can be little. It can be you innovating in broadcasting or someone opening a beauty salon in the neighborhood. They're taking a chance. They're entrepreneurs, and that is innovation.
Process innovations are important. We tend to prefer product innovations, but usually process innovations are responsible for increasing productivity. So countries like Jamaica, they require process innovations, especially in the context of low productivity.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, if your procedures for, I don't know, harvesting sugar cane to take an old output of Jamaica are bad, if they're badly done, you can obviously do better by buying machines, say, that do a better job. But I think all countries are capable of product innovation too. Jerked meat.
Yes.
Is a very good thing to eat.
Yeah, I like jerk chicken. It's a Jamaican staple. No,
I have a friend, an American, who's married to a Jamaican, and he goes down there very frequently. And he makes very good jerked meat. He's very good at it.
You know, Deirdre, despite its problems, I believe that most people wish they lived in Jamaica.
Well, I'm not, it gets there pretty hot there in the summer. But on the other hand, as I said, I would love to, if the University of Jamaica will give me an honorary degree.
University of West Indies. The University of West Indies.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You've sort of consolidated, which is a smart idea, by the way. Okay, if they give me an honorary degree, I'll come down. I'll go to Jamaica and anywhere else. I'm very hungry for honorary degrees, I have to say. It's a vanity of old age, I admit.
All right.
Foolish.
Now, let's get back to the great divergence. What do we owe to institutions?
Well, I'm just before I started speaking to you, I was working on a paper that I'm going to give to the Economic History Association meeting in Tucson, Arizona, in about how long is it? About 3 weeks. And the title of the paper is that institutions don't matter. And it's the actual argument in the paper is not quite as radical as that. But the problem is that institutions are intermediate. And everyone pretty much will admit that. The American Constitution, for example, didn't just fall on what became the United States from God or something. It was made up by people with various ideas and interests, admittedly, and the same is true of all innovations. They come from, all institutions come from ideas, and innovations come from ideas, and human action comes from ideas. You have the idea of starting a show like this, and then you implement it, but you had to have the idea first, and then the market or something decides what the circulation is. So the institution of, say, Zoom, let's take that as an institution, is, well, for one thing, Zoom had to be thought up in someone's head. And it's sustained by various ethical, ideological, and engineering knowledge in people's heads. I mean, here's an interesting case. In the early days of the internet, which I remember very well, people were extremely impolite to each other. And that was because they had no experience with this email way of communicating with other people. So they were very sharp in their comments. I myself was guilty of that. But then what essentially happened is that the institution changed because people got in their hearts a realization that it was very hard to express subtle emotions through email. So you get these emojis, I guess they're called, and people restrain themselves. I've noticed it. You can't say the same about Twitter, but so it goes. Ethical, ideas, the things your mother taught you affect how you behave, and in particular, how you arrange your institutions. So here's my point. To get, as you yourself have been suggesting, to get real fast growth and enrichment in Jamaica, attitudes need to change. It's ideas, ideologies, attitudes that make for innovation and fast growth.
Yes, and Deirdre, you reintroduced F.W. Matlon to the debate. Property rights in England have been secured for a long time, but the Industrial Revolution did not occur in the medieval ages.
That's right. Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, my friend Douglas North, the late Douglas North, was a wonderful, amazing man.
Very astute.
Very astute, but wrong, I have to say, because look, most science is this way. Even Newton, in the end, proved to be wrong about the structure of the universe. In small areas, like within our solar system or galaxy, he's correct. But at the really macro level of the universe, Newton is wrong. All science has the capability, one hopes, of being either continuously proven to be correct or found to be wrong. And I think that's true of Doug's work. He focused on institutions quite late in his career, actually. Earlier in his career, as I just wrote in this piece I'm doing, he was unusually reluctant to talk about institutions. So it sort of came as a revelation in his 60s, in his case, that institutions were important. And again, the problem is that institutions like capital and labor are intermediate. You have the idea for French haute cuisine, say, or for some dish, right, in French cooking, and then the output is an excellent meal. But the things in between, the ingredients, the capital of the oven, the training of the cook, and so forth, those in a very important sense are merely the intermediate causes, not the ultimate causes of the excellent meal. The excellent meal is caused by the unusual creativity of French people over many centuries in cuisine.
It's an indisputable fact that institutions are undergirded by what one scholar calls cognitive rules. Institutions require culture. So, for example, there's a famous paper titled "Why is Cat?" Well, I'm a bit mistaken in the title, but I read the paper some time ago. But the paper is basically questioning the inability of capitalism to flow to developing countries. I'm sure you're familiar with that paper. And there's also another paper titled "Why is Capital Unlikely to Flow to Developing Countries?" Maybe we need a paper titled "Why Are Institutions Unlikely to Flow to Developing Countries?"
Well, I'm not sure the institutions are much help. Look, you could actually, in Jamaica, you have English law, but suppose you have a country that doesn't have English law to begin with, and then you introduce English law by handing out a bunch of English textbooks on common law, and then you give all the lawyers white wigs and robes. Well, clearly that's not going to work. You're not going to get the spirit of English law that way. In fact, an interesting case is Pakistan, which indeed, because of the Raj, does have English law. And among its lawyers, it has a tradition of judicial independence, which is just barely what keeps Pakistan from being wholly totalitarian. Because the lawyers in Pakistan have professionalism, self-respect, that lawyers in say Russia do not, or in China for that matter. But it's not the sort of having a Supreme Court, a building called the Supreme Court. My father actually was an expert on the history of the Supreme Court. And my father-in-law, he was a stonecutter. No, my father-in-law's father was a stonecutter, and he himself inscribed equal justice under law on the American Supreme Court. He did it. He did the stonework. Anyway, so you have the stonework, you have the building, you have even the history. And it doesn't work if the occupiers of those 9 chairs are corrupt.
You're right. You're 150% accurate, Deirdre. So, for example, Raphael Laporta, he has written widely on the common law and its relationship to economic growth. He's following in the footsteps of F.A. Hayek, and I do tend to side with Raphael. But then again, Jamaica's the common law, but we have been unable to induce growth, and it can be attributed to what you mentioned earlier. It's a combination of attitudes and culture. So, for example, in the arena of squatting is a problem in Jamaica. Politicians have been known to side with people who squat.
Yeah.
Common law requires a certain culture to work. People must respect the rule of law. It must be applied fairly.
Well, very interestingly, squatting was very common in Holland, of all places, or for that matter, as you know, for some time in London. And I think it's beginning to die out in both places. But in any case, even these places with very strong civil law traditions in Holland or common law traditions in Britain, as you just said, didn't have. I have a friend, a student actually, in Holland, who for years has lived in a squat in central London. I think he's out of it now, but for some years, this scholar, this academic, lived illegally in someone else's house, and he had no problems with it. It sort of depends how widespread such attitudes are, and not that he's a particularly bad man. He's a very good man in most things. But look, what we should be doing is pointing the scientific microscope towards attitudes and how they're formed, what sort of grand institutions like liberalism as against to totalitarianism encourage them, encourage ideas, encourage new ideas, certainly free speech and so forth, encourages ideas. And that you could call that an institution, go ahead. But it's not the, I don't know how to say this, the middle level institutions that North usually talked about that are the key here. It's the fundamental, I don't like the word culture very much because it's so vague, but it's the fundamental rhetorical traditions, the ethical precepts that people actually put into practice that matter.
Exactly. We should be asking, how do countries get to Denmark? I'm yet to see a good book on that topic.
Yeah, that's right. I was just in Denmark a few weeks ago. I have friends there, and I was quite struck by how, by the way, how they've come through the COVID thing. They've had lots of deaths, but now they wear their masks, where they're wearing their masks, I think inside a little bit, but not very much.
No, Denmark has been able to manage the COVID situation in a more superb manner because of one, trusting institutions, and two,
well, that's true.
Politicians.
That's certainly true.
Politicians in Denmark lead by example.
I know.
If the vaccine is proven to be defective, they're not going to compel the population to use it. And as a result, people in Denmark are more likely to take the vaccine because they trust their politicians.
Well, that's one way to look at it. And you understand, I think, very well, that can have bad effects. If you trust the politicians too much, you can be led down various authoritarian streets that way. Say, oh, well, the government must be good. And I must say that American foreign policy since the Second World War has been a case of Americans being led down the wrong street of foreign activism. So there's that problem. And what's more characteristic of the Danes is that they trust each other. Although, by the way, they steal a lot of bicycles. So here's the key point. You can describe liberalism, which is the politics that I prefer in the European sense, liberalism, as adultism. Now, an adult, that is to say, the political theory that no one except actual children or a few actual prisoners should be treated as a child or a slave. Everyone should be treated as an adult. That doesn't mean you don't help them if they have an earthquake or something, but it means that you assign responsibility to people. And that's what Denmark has been pretty good at. In fact, they were quite worried some years ago about how their welfare system was discouraging responsibility, adult responsibility. But I think on the whole, they accept adult responsibility. And the problem is that every other political philosophy treats the citizens either as sad children or bad children. On the left, it's, oh, you poor child, speaking to an adult, here, let me help you. I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And on the right, oh, you're a bad child. You're not sad, you're bad. And I've got to use the army to control you, the army or the police. So bad or sad is not how to go. We ought to be we ought to have politics in which people are treated like adults.
Again,
And again, populism is the opposite of this.
Again, Denmark is such a poignant case study. Recently, I read an article on getting to Denmark. So I wanted a good academic piece on getting to Denmark, and I was
I understand
unable
your
to
point.
locate that piece. However, I did locate a piece on Denmark, and this piece is basically arguing that the elites are crucial to development. And in Denmark, elites were responsible for the agricultural revolution. And I'm just rushing this point because I am interested in the role of elites in facilitating economic growth. Remember, Deidre, most movements are led by middle class and wealthy people, not necessarily the poor.
Yeah, that's right.
The poor like to demonstrate, but the real organizers are wealthy people.
Yeah, or ordinarily that's true. It's the taking as an example, the hero of my youth when I was a Marxist, Lenin. He was bourgeois. His father was a educational bureaucrat in Tsarist Russia. He himself trained as a lawyer, which is maybe one reason he was so good at argument. It's as in the French Revolution, and indeed the American Revolution, it's the elite that lead. Now, I'm not particularly thrilled by that. But on the other hand, in a free society, poor people can have a voice in politics. I mean, the most horrible thing that the Republicans have done in the United States, the Republican Party, is this campaign to restrict voting, especially of African Americans and Hispanic Americans too. So I think the ordinary people, the poor, are, well, look, we've all been poor. I don't mean individually. I haven't ever been really poor, but I mean our ancestors were poor.
Yes.
Our ancestors were unspeakably poor. My Irish peasant ancestors couldn't read, and yours couldn't either.
Not at all.
So it's what we want is societies in which people have permission to try things out. I think it's quite important to substitute the word permission for the word opportunity.
Permissionless innovation.
Yeah, but people often talk about equality of opportunity. The trouble with that is that it leads right on to a childish mentality of expecting the government to provide me with opportunity. Whereas if all that the government says is go for it, feel free. And that then makes for real innovation, because people then have every incentive to think of new ways of doing things, opening that hairdressing salon, which, as you can see, I need, or in inventing the steam engine.
And bourgeois dignity, Deidre, also validates the ordinary man. Remember, if you're Henry Ford, you want to enrich ordinary people who are able to purchase your commodities.
That's
so, for example, my show, so far the show has been doing well based on my ability to attract big name writers like yourself. But if I'm going to make millions, I need ordinary people to listen.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And that's exactly right. Innovism, which is a word I much prefer to the usual word capitalism, depends, as you just said, on people buying it. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't such things as collective goods, which we buy as a group. But for the most part, the things we consume, we buy individually. And the poor in aggregate have as much to say about that as the rich in aggregate. I have cable TV, as a lot of people do these days, which gives me 400 channels of rubbish.
Exactly. I don't like TV. Most of the shows are really,
well, I'm a kind of a TV addict, and I watch it a lot. What I do is I work on my reading or papers or talking to you or someone, and then I get tired of writing, say. I go over and watch TV, but often I only watch for 15 minutes because it's so terrible.
Deirdre, I'm a fan of the Golden Girls because the Golden Girls alluded to our present era. The Golden Girls were
Oh yes, I
celebrating
know what you
gay
mean.
marriage. They were celebrating gay marriage before we could
Aren't they wonderful?
envision the idea of gay marriage.
Well, from
Golden Girls had
I
an
know.
interracial relationship. The son of Dorothy was
Absolutely.
married to a black woman, and she was an older black woman.
Absolutely. That was a quite innovative show. But from a woman's point of view, I can point out, dear, you might not have noticed it. What's especially great about the Golden Girls is their outfits, which are terrific for older women because they're all older women. And so they're not little things that you can wear when you're in your 20s, but things you can wear in your 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah, but the Golden Girls, they are revolutionary, and I will not say word. They are revolutionary.
Well, but that's a very important point. That it's things like this, and pop music, and movies, and TV shows. That's where we do our thinking about what kind of society we want to be, what kind of people we want to be. It's not so much in academic books, although they can be an inspiration, I suppose. But as we say in country music, where the rubber meets the road is in journalism and popular culture. For instance, the Soviets were very reluctant to let jazz come into the Soviet Union. And people would have to smuggle in jazz records in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And I think the problem was that jazz, I mean real jazz of various kinds, embodies liberty. It is liberty. Take Kind of Blue, the record with Miles Davis, which was, by the way, produced in one take. It's improvisation. So it says, we don't need central planning to do music. Whereas the standard symphony orchestra, which I like very much, is nonetheless a central planning example. So jazz and rock music could undermine authoritarian top-down politics.
But music is revolutionary, Deirdre. Just look at reggae music in Jamaica, jazz music, and protest music, punk music is revolutionary. And music is responsible for shaping pop culture. The Simpsons. Is art imitating life, or is life imitating art?
Absolutely.
Interesting question.
That's certainly true, and that's been true forever. The drama of the Greeks, the inventors of drama, it's a Greek word, were reflecting on and forming Greek, especially Athenian, understanding of itself.
Yes. Greek philosophy and literature are both equally compelling and interesting. Deirdre, so for example, my show, I guess that people like my show. I'm not one to toot my own horn, but I sent an email to an academic once, and he said, I love your show. I did not know that he was watching the show. But for pop culture can mature, but for pop culture to mature, we need someone who's really famous, like Donald Trump. I don't care for Donald Trump, and you don't care for Donald Trump. But if Donald Trump were to, well, it's not on Twitter, but let's say Donald Trump was on Twitter. If Donald Trump were to retweet the show, then it will become really famous.
Yeah, it's true. The fame is very strange. You know, you can become famous by assassinating Abraham Lincoln, or you can become famous by writing a very good song. And I prefer the latter.
Yeah, writing a very good song. It's just like that podcast, Call Me Daddy. So she's a young woman making millions, and because there's a demand for a podcast, people like to hear about sex. That's
Oh, yeah.
value. I may not be interested in listening to that podcast, but people are more likely to listen to Call Me Daddy than to listen to you.
Unfortunately.
Exactly. Unfortunately, so to make money, I'm actually shocked that I have over 1,000 subscribers, because to make money on YouTube when you're following my path, it is really difficult.
Well,
Yeah,
you
getting
could.
getting people like yourself is difficult. You're not going to just show up and be interviewed by a random guy from nowhere. And making money is also difficult, and getting over 1,000 subscribers is even more difficult. But luckily, people seem to like my work.
Well, but I look. The newspaper went through the same evolution that the internet's going through. Newspapers in the early 19th century had very small runs. You might produce 4,000 a day, and that's it. And so they could only survive with subsidies from political parties. That was one standard thing. Or indeed, and this is very strange, but it was quite common, by extorting money from their victims. A journalist would come to someone with an embarrassing story and say, look, we're going to publish this tomorrow unless you give me £100. But in the middle of the 19th century, the steam press was invented, cheap paper was invented, the taxation that had formerly been imposed on newspapers was abandoned in Britain. And the result was that suddenly you could do 500,000 or 1 million copies a day, right? You went from 4,000 to 500,000 copies a day, and then advertising became profitable. So for a long time, newspapers were, well, they still are to some degree, but much less than they were made possible by advertising. So I suggest you introduce advertising.
Well, I'm attracting ads. Again, Deirdre, I'm not one to complain. My growth has been astronomical. One day in March, I decided to start a show, and today I'm interviewing you, and my growth is astronomical. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that in the marketplace, value is subjective, and most people are going to listen to Call Me Daddy. And why should they not listen to Call Me Daddy? It is funny and relatable.
Well, maybe you should change your name to Call Me Daddy.
Yes, but back to the great divergence. What do we owe to trade? What do we owe to trade?
Not very much. Well, it depends on how you look at it. Look, obviously trade, by the way, you keep mentioning the great divergence. That's the notion that there is a big divergence between the West and the rest, but that's converging. India and China are growing very fast. Botswana is comparatively prosperous. Chile is doing very well. So I think the great divergence, which a friend of mine, Pomerantz, introduced, is temporary. Now, I'm not saying it'll be over tomorrow, but it's temporary. What's really extraordinary is the thing itself, namely the great enrichment. That's amazing, and explaining it is well worth a lot of thought. How to make the whole world rich. Now, I think that in the next 50 or 100 years, the whole world will become rich. I don't think there's really any question about that. Say there's a hand up here. Is that someone asking a question?
No, maybe that was my sorry, no, just ignore it. But in your book, Deirdre, you argue that trade is normal. It is not unusual, and we
Yeah.
benefit from the gains of trade. So, for
We
example,
enormously benefit from the gains
yes.
of trade.
So, for
But
example, trade with China, because of trade
but
with China, savings go up.
say, for example, but trade is not an engine of growth that people think it is. There's an awful lot of kind of silly talk about this. The real engine of growth is innovation, new ideas, as you said, new ideas for process and product. And the trade, of course, in order to make you make an automobile and you make it better in Japan than General Motors is making it in Detroit. And so you introduce Toyotas, and that's good for people for Americans. Even though some Americans lose their job, millions of Americans are able to buy much better automobiles. So that's what makes us well off, and trade is necessary for it. But trade just by itself doesn't enrich people much.
I think that not you, but some economists have failed to really explain trade at the micro level. Either trade is an inducement strategy, but not a panacea. We trade all the time. Deficits are not bad. When you eat Kentucky,
Yeah,
that's
that's
a
right.
deficit, but you're gaining via the food.
That's
So
right.
economists have not successfully explained
Well,
trade. Well, some of them at least.
we've been trying to do it for 2 centuries without much result. I agree. This obsession with the balance of payments in Britain in the 1950s and 60s, there was so-called stop-go economic policy that was mainly caused by the deterioration, as the jargon went, of the balance of payments. And Britain would start to grow. Britons would import a lot of stuff that would worsen, as people keep saying, the balance of payments. And the government would clamp down. We're raising bank rate and so on and so forth. And that was a silly policy. Here, no one would know that there was a balance of payments deficit in the accounts of Jamaica, for example, unless the government published the numbers. No one would know it.
And no one would care.
No one would care. Whereas inflation in Jamaica, or unemployment in Jamaica, or a failure to grow in Jamaica, those are things that actually people feel. They just have to go to the grocery store to feel it. So I'm saddened when I see economists advocating worrying about the balance of payments.
It's insensible. If you're really familiar with economic literature and quantitative methods, you shouldn't care about deficits. As someone, what's his name again, Mark Perry of the American Enterprise Institute, he has these charts chronicling the relationship between trade deficits and employment.
Yeah.
Deirdre,
that's right.
Deirdre, you don't need to respond because the answer is quite obvious. The relationship between colonial possession and the economic growth is negative.
Yeah.
Empire building does not explain the great enrichment.
It certainly doesn't. And I show that in the book, and I'm just using other people's findings. I'm not the great pioneer in the scholarship here. But it's quite clear when you do the calculations that although imperialism might have damaged Jamaicans or Indians, especially in their soul, so to speak.
It is an ideological effect, not necessarily an economical effect. It's more ideological.
Right. That's right. But even if Jamaicans and Indians and South Africans and so on had been hurt by British imperialism, the Britons weren't much helped by it.
No, not at all.
The ordinary people, the roads in South Africa made a lot of money, but ordinary people in Britain.
Taxpayers were responsible for financing industrial expansion. It was a rent-seeking enterprise.
Yeah, but there's in industrial expansion was not
industrial expansion. Sorry, colonial expansion,
Oh,
not
yeah,
industrial
yeah.
expansion.
That's right. That's right. Colonial expansion was self-financing. You would extract from the Indians, and those would pay the salaries of the quite small bureaucracy of the Raj. But the Navy, half of its cost was protecting the sea routes to India. And the Navy was not paid for by the Indians. That was paid for by British taxpayers.
Exactly. So, for example, for instance, the textile industry, even without exposure to the British economy, the textile industry in India would have collapsed anyway, according to some studies.
I think that that's true. And look, any change is costly to someone. I think this is a point that even economists don't quite feel in their heart. They don't quite understand it. So in a perfectly run socialist economy, in which the central planner was all wise and had all power and was nice to people, which is hard to imagine. But suppose the central planners were, they would do the same things that a perfectly functioning innovism would, because progress, the remarkable progress that Jamaica, you may feel that Jamaica hasn't done as well as it could, and that's probably true, but it's still, Jamaicans are much better off now than they were in 1950 or in 1900, and that comes from allowing innovation, not from stealing from people. So enrichment comes from innovation, not from imperialism.
Yes, and Paul Bayrook, is it Bayrook or Bayroach?
Who again?
Paul, the expert on urbanization.
I don't know who you mean.
Yeah, maybe I believe you may have cited him, but I can't pronounce his name. He wrote on innovation and non-colonialism, Bayroch. In one of his books, he argues that the relationship between colonial possessions and growth is negative, and he does a thorough study.
Yeah. Well, I think that's more or less true.
But this is one stable that will not die. It will not die.
Well, because of the people don't do the accounting right. They think, well, Southeast Asians or say North Africans were exploited by the French. Now, suppose you believe that, or by some French, express it that way. It doesn't follow on the other side of the accounts that the French were made much better off by this so-called exploitation. So look, if I rob a convenience store with a gun, I come in and I hold them up. Now that we all have masks, for COVID, we could all become convenience store robbers. Anyway, I go in, I get from the till $38.40. But in the course of the robbery, I shoot the clerk and kill him. Well, obviously, the cost is enormous on that guy and on the store. But the gain to me is only this tiny amount of cash that I get. You see what I mean? So that it's not obvious that because someone else is hurt, you're made better off.
Not at all. That's a zero-sum mentality.
That's right. It's a zero-sum mentality, which thinks that every hurt has a corresponding gain to someone else, and that's just unreasonable. You can be violent towards a bunch of people, and kill them and lynch them like we used to do in the South of the United States, actually earlier in lots of parts of the United States, and that doesn't accrue to the benefit of the people who do the lynching.
Exactly. So, Deirdre, this is the last question. We're wrapping up. Markets are really important, but markets are not unusual. So what do we owe to markets?
Well, we owe a lot to markets. It's the same thing as trade. You can't have progress without trade and markets. because that spreads the news, so to speak. Look, invention. Sam Walton, invented the use of barcodes to control inventory. That's the central idea in Walmart. It then became adopted by all the retailers, but that was his main innovation. And that's why this tiny little store in Fayetteville, Arkansas became Walmart. Okay, you say, well, gee, that's going to make Sam Walton's family enormously wealthy. And it happens they are. I know someone who knows the children of Sam Walton personally. I don't, but he does. All right. But most of the benefit accrues to the consumers. The Walmart, which is often disdained by the elite, gives cheap goods to poor people. And it's not free. So the Waltons make 2% on every sale, which makes them immensely wealthy compared with you and me. But the 98% goes to you and me.
So for example, Deirdre, I have an interesting counterpoint for those arguing that Walmart is a negative. It is the positive effect of Walmart on reducing racism. So for instance, Walmart destroyed mom and pop shops. Okay, this is unfortunate for these shops. However, when you live in a small town, you're only exposed to people in your community, and usually these people tend to be white. Therefore, when Walmart destroys these companies, you are compelled to associate with people who are outside of your immediate group, and some of these individuals could be Black, Asian, or from North Africa. So Walmart may have a positive effect on conducing favorable human interactions.
I think you'd find that's an interesting point, and I think it's probably true. It's certainly true of of a lot of other retail organizations, and as you're pointing out, the larger they are, the less they can wisely impose discrimination. If, as you said, the mom and pop store can do all right, though enforcing segregation or something like that, but a large company trying to do it loses, in absolute terms, a lot of money by doing that. So and the same is true in hiring.
Exactly. So Deirdre, I'm really enjoying the conversation, but I have to wrap up. If I follow my mind, we'll speak forever. But bye, Deirdre, and we'll talk again. Dear. And I'm going to send you the Boris email.
Please do, and also send me a link to what we're doing here.
Of course, you're going to get it.
So that I can put it on my website.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, dear. Bye-bye.